These spending plans were audited less than 5 months ago. But Labour says there's a black hole the last government covered up. Difficult decisions will now be made harder, and tax rises are on the cards after the new Chancellor says she discovered tens of billions of pounds of unfunded promises the Treasury can't afford to meet.
Today I am calling out the Conservatives' cover-up. The government published its plans for day-to-day spending in the spring budget in March. But when I arrived at the Treasury, on the very first day, I was alerted by officials that this was not how much the previous government expected to spend this year. It wasn't even close. In fact, the total pressures on these budgets across a range of areas was an additional £35 billion.
Her accusations triggered an increasingly personal clash between her and the man who used to hold her office.
Some, including the leader of the opposition and the shadow chancellor, have claimed the books were open. How dare they? It is not true.
Jeremy Hunt.
She wants to blame the last Conservative government for tax rises and project cancellations she's been planning all along. And doing it this way, she makes the first major misstep of her time as Chancellor, because that great office of state depends more than any on trust. Yet in her first big moment, she breaks that trust with an utterly bogus attempt to hoodwink the public about the choices she has. Over 50 times in the election, they told us they had no plans to raise taxes. Now, in a U-turn that will forever shame this Labour government, she is laying the ground to break her word. And when she does, her first budget will become the biggest betrayal in history by a new Chancellor, and working families will never forgive her.
But in a blow to the last government, the Office for Budget Responsibility immediately announced it would launch an investigation into whether the Conservatives failed in their transparency at the spring budget. The OBR said the government faces one of the biggest overspends outside the pandemic. In the vault, the government has a £9 billion rainy day fund for emergencies, but Labour claims there's £35 billion worth of cost due this year, including a £6.4 billion hotel bill for asylum seekers Rishi Sunak hoped to send to Rwanda. There's also the cost of Boris Johnson's 40 new hospitals and a raft of road schemes, including the Stonehenge Tunnel. None of these say the government had any funding, leaving the rainy day fund with a £22 billion black hole. But the public sector pay recommendations will be adopted by Reeves.
We demand better!
The cost of the 5.5% boost, an extra £9.4 billion. Today, a deal was also finally signed with junior doctors, who have agreed a 22% pay increase over 2 years, something that'll have to be funded in the autumn. This is a great win for Abacus Accounting, and Labour have now promised that new budgets will always be strictly kept under control. The problem is that none of this amounts to growth. Plus, when it comes to October's budget, it suggests new tax rises will be necessary in order to protect public services and public borrowing. Is it right for the Chancellor to describe it as a cover-up?
Some of the numbers were not as transparent as they should have been. The £6 billion asylum bill, for example, didn't really appear anywhere in the public domain in terms of how that would be funded. The big numbers, though, that Rachel Reeves was talking about, £9 billion for public sector pay, we knew that that sort of money was not made available in the budgets, and we knew that it was not going to be enough.
Is there a question about the spring budget?
I think there's a big question about the choices that the last government made for both in the autumn and in the spring for a £20 billion cut in national insurance contributions. Given the scale of pressures on public spending, that never looked particularly like a good economic thing to do from an economic point of view. If anything, it's looking even worse given the numbers, some of the numbers we've seen today.
It seems the battle for tax and spend didn't end with the election. If anything, it's intensifying. Rachel Reeves knows she's got some difficult decisions to sell, including higher taxes and cuts to benefits in the autumn. She wants to be known as the ironclad Chancellor. What's less clear is whether she'll end up being a popular one. Well, what have we learned? Well, that big debate about whether there was or there wasn't a black hole seems to be tilting in Rachel Reeves' favour. You know, the IFS, as we just heard, seems to accept that there were billions of pounds of spending they knew nothing about. The OBR's investigation into potential obstruction could end up being quite uncomfortable for the Conservatives. But when it comes to public sector pay, it's worth remembering that much of that detail was in the public domain. Today, we also had news alongside this of cuts, £3 billion of cuts when it comes to departments, and the more controversial news that 10 million pensioners will find their winter fuel allowance cut. Now, campaigners said they will bitterly oppose that. And finally, get your diaries out because the budget will be on the 30th of October, and nothing here today addresses future black holes. That will be a battleground for next month.
Helia Ebrahimi, thank you. Well, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, joins me now from Westminster. Good evening. We asked you all the way through the election campaign that, you know, you'd probably have to make cuts to spending and raise taxes. And sure enough, that's what it's looking like. Now, the precise reason might be slightly different, but it adds up to the same thing for the British people. You know, do you think the election campaign was honest?
Yes, because the things that the Chancellor set out today to the House of Commons are things that nobody but former Conservative ministers knew. There were a whole string of projects that were never funded, and yet Conservative ministers had the barefaced cheek to stand up to promise these things to people across the country, knowing that the money was never there. And you might remember the press conference that we held during the election campaign with John Ashworth, who was part of our national campaign team, where he said the money is not there for the commitments they've made in their manifesto. We never expected that the level of maladministration would be so negligent that there was no money for the projects they'd even announced in government, let alone for the things in their manifesto.
But you're pinning it on ministers. I mean, the truth is, civil servants, the same civil servants who were responsible for this overspend, they were actually doing it and didn't report it, are now telling you, oh, there's this massive overspend. It's not just Conservative ministers, is it? It's the officials who were also running all these projects.
Krishnan, come on. I mean, look, civil servants advise ministers. Ministers decide. Ministers are accountable. That is why I'm on your show this evening. Ministers will have been briefed in the same way that I and the Chancellor have been briefed. They will have known about the trade-offs to their decisions.
So the question is, you know, it can't just be ministers who are covering it up because they weren't the only people who knew.
Ministers are the people who are responsible to Parliament and to the public for the decisions that ministers take. Even the Office of Budget Responsibility confirmed today in a letter to the Chancellor when she sat down that they had not been told about the overspend in year put into train by previous ministers from the last Conservative government. So you didn't know, I didn't know, the independent checks and balances in the system didn't know. The only people who did know and who should be accountable for that are the Conservative ministers we've now booted out of office.
The decisions you're taking, though, and today are really sweeping. I mean, if you'd have gone into that election saying we now have no intention of implementing Andrew Dilnot's cap on social care, you'd have had a tough argument. And you're able to just do that now sweepingly. And that's a terrible thing for the social care system now, isn't it?
Well, look, the stark reality of the Dilnot reforms is that the previous lot in government hadn't done the work to make sure they could even be implemented in the winter of this year when they were intended to be.
But you said you intended to do it.
Operationally, they couldn't have been implemented because they hadn't done the work. Now, look, Krishnan, I didn't want to come into government and have to make this set of announcements at this stage, nor did the Chancellor. She was very clear about that today. But we are going to be honest with the British people about what the Conservatives left behind. And yes, we are going to make the tough decisions about fixing those foundations so that we can rebuild our country in the spending review, in the budget, and in the years ahead of this Labour government. We have got to clear up their mess because this cannot continue. And the British people will know from our very clear commitments at the election that only Labour can be trusted with the economy.
Right. I mean, but doesn't this highlight something deeper about the sort of the shallow nature of our politics at the moment? I mean, you made this pre-election pledge not to cut national insurance, income tax and VAT. When we look back at what happened in March, the then Chancellor did a £20 billion national insurance cut. surely that's the sensible thing to reverse, because that's basically the size of the black hole.
Well, look, you're right that the former Conservative Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, must have known that he didn't have enough money to pay all the bills whilst cutting taxes. We didn't know that in opposition at the time. But what we do know in the Labour Party is we made that promise to the British people in the election not to increase income tax, national insurance,
but it was
and
a
VAT.
silly promise, is my point now, wasn't it? Because
well, that's your view. It's a promise we made. It's not going to be a promise that we will break, because we think it's really important in politics that when you make these promises, you honour them, and that is what we're going to do, even if it makes our lives harder, quite frankly, by honouring that promise that we made.
OK, well, I mean, I think about 10 days before the election, I put to you, you are almost certainly going to be looking at capital gains tax, corporation tax, and I suppose inheritance tax as well. We could add to that. And I'm not asking you to sort of tell us what's in the budget, but that's the honest thing, isn't it? People who, and they are working people who pay all these taxes, need to be thinking, well, some combination of those is going to have to go up. That's what we're being warned today.
Well, look, we're doing everything possible to make sure that we're bearing down on these costs. We've highlighted the projects and the policies today that were never funded by the Conservatives and been honest to people about the fact that they will not be funded going forward. We've made difficult decisions on, for example, the deal not reforms to social care, on winter fuel payments, and on other policy areas to get down costs in year. But then we're going to move to the budget and the spending review that I will run to start to face the future so that we can rebuild on the foundations that we've reset.
But having ruled out income tax, VAT and national insurance, we're left with those, aren't we? We're looking at capital gains, inheritance, pensions tax relief, corporation tax. That's what you're left with.
Well, look, the budget will set out the full detail, but we are working really hard, not just in advance of today, but over the coming months as we get towards the budget on the 30th of October, to make sure that we are taking inefficiencies out of the system. We've said that we want the consultancy budget to come down. The last government was spending an absolute fortune on digital content for Tory ministers on social media. We're cutting that, and we're closing down the things that have not been funded properly. So we're doing everything possible to get this nation's finances under control. And at the budget, we will set out, having closed that financial year 24-25 at the budget and starting to face the future, how we will reset what we've inherited from the Conservatives and start to face the future with the change that Labour offered at this election that we are absolutely committed to delivering.
Darren Jones, thank you very much.